Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about the relationship between Russia and India. If you've been following the channel, you'll be fully aware that India have actually increased the amount of oil that they've been buying from Russia over the past few years. They weren't buying any oil at all from Russia before the war in Ukraine started. However, at one point they became Russia's biggest single customer, overtaking China, buying more than 2.1 million barrels per day. So the ongoing relationship between the two nations is absolutely critical to Russia. India is basically holding up the Russian economy. And you may have seen in the papers and in the press and on the TV that President Putin actually recently went over to India. So he made a state visit, which is quite unusual for him to go. It's the first one that he's done since 2021, before the war in Ukraine started. And you can see in this footage here that he met with Modi, who is the Prime Minister of India. And if you don't know, India also has a president, Murmu, so he met with her as well. And you can see that he's being introduced to all of the delegates from India, and then everybody was introduced to all of the Russian delegates, and this all looked like happy families. And before we go on to talk about what was actually formally announced following those meetings, I thought it was worth just having a quick look at some of the key relationships between the two countries. So this chart shows the countries that India has been buying its defence weapons from, dating back to before 2000. So we've got colour coding here. The blue section at the bottom shows the purchases from Russia. We've then got a grey section, which is other countries. Israel is the pink section, France the orange section, and the yellow section at the top is the USA. So if we look back to the late 1990s, early 2000s, you can see that the vast majority of all of India's defence equipment was being purchased from Russia, 79%. However, that figure has come down significantly over the past 25 years or so. Russia is still the single biggest supplier of arms to India, providing around 40%. But as you can see here, Israel has significantly stepped up its sale of arms to India, providing 27% in 2024. France provided 14%, and the USA 8.7%, and 10.3% came from other countries. So India and Russia have a long-standing relationship with regards to the sale of arms. Now, just before we go on any further today, could I ask anyone that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that red subscriber button? It doesn't cost you anything. It's not really a proper subscription. You're not signing up to pay me any money, but it does help me with the algorithm and also helps to put a smile on my face. This chart shows the countries that India has been buying its crude oil from, dating back to 2013. And what this shows is that back in those days, there was a variety of different countries supplying India with oil. The biggest one was Saudi Arabia, followed by Venezuela, Iraq, Kuwait, Nigeria, and Iran. So a mixed bag of different countries providing oil to India. And India was basically looking for the best price. And as you can see, over the past 10 years or so, the amount of oil that India is buying has increased significantly, from around about 3.4 million barrels per day to the current levels of 5 million barrels per day. And if we have a look at the red section, which indicates the sales from Russia to India, you can see that it first appeared in 2014, which was actually when Russia invaded Crimea, and some sanctions were placed against Russia. So Russia was starting to look for new partners at that time, but those sanctions were relatively limited. So there weren't a lot of sales in 2014, 2015, and 2016. In 2017, we started to see a slight increase, so the red section got bigger. It then increased a little bit in 2019, 2020, and 2021, but still it was relatively small from India's perspective. However, immediately following the invasion of Ukraine, when the global sanctions were applied by the West against Russia, Russia desperately needed to find somebody else to buy its oil, and so was offering really good deals, big discounts against global prices. And you can see that the red section increased significantly in 2022. So you can see that in that year, the biggest supplier of oil to India was Iraq, followed, roughly speaking, jointly by Saudi Arabia and Russia, and then the UAE came in at third, and the USA was actually supplying a reasonable amount at that time. Now, in 2023, we saw a huge increase in the amount of oil that India was buying from Russia. It became by far its largest supplier. And that situation has continued in 2024 and 2025. However, as you can see from the chart, we're starting to see a slight reduction in the amount that India was purchasing in 24 and 25. So it wasn't quite as high as 2023, but still significantly more than any other country. And if we look at the balance of trade between the two countries over the past 6 years, you can see that there's been huge movements here. So in 2020, the Indian year ends in March, so this is the 12 months to March. So you can see that in the period to March 2020, India exported a small amount to Russia and imported a little bit more. So it had a negative balance of trade. That situation continued in 2021. In 2022, now this is the period just to March, and the invasion of Ukraine took place in February. So there was only a limited amount of time when India was looking to buy Russian oil and Russia was looking to sell to India. And that resulted in a trade deficit between the two countries increasing marginally. We then saw a huge increase in the amount of purchases by India from Russia. So the balance of trade fell into huge negative territory. That situation continued in 2024. This is the period through to March 24. And in the year to March 25, there was a record deficit in the trade between the two countries of $59 billion. India purchased just under $64 billion worth of goods from Russia. Russia purchased just under $5 billion of goods from India. So if you take a step back and look at this chart, Russia hasn't really significantly increased its purchases of Indian goods and services. However, India has massively increased the amount it's purchasing from Russia. So this trade relationship benefits Russia a lot more than it benefits India. Now, obviously, India has been buying that oil because it's cheaper than Brent crude and other global oil. So that's why it wants to do it. So it's not just looking at the trade deficit and thinking, well, we've got to rebalance this in the same way that Donald Trump did recently when he was talking about how much the USA trades with the rest of the world and why he wanted to impose tariffs. He wanted to have an equilibrium. This situation is beneficial to both parties because India's getting cheap oil and Russia's finding somewhere to actually place its oil. Now, in terms of the meeting that was had recently in India, there were a number of announcements that came out of that. And I thought it was worth going through those announcements because I think it's important to look at what was actually said and then interpret exactly what this means for the relationship going forward. There was an economic cooperation program 2030 that was announced, whereby Russia and India agreed on a new long-term roadmap targeting $100 billion in bilateral trade by 2030. So if we jump back to that chart that we've just looked at, the bilateral trade at the moment is sitting at around about 70 billion. So that would be an increase of around 30 billion. But as we said, most of that trade is going from Russia to India. It's not going the other way around. And there was a broader goal announced that the partnership should move away from being dominated by just oil and defense. So they're going to start doing lots of other types of business together. Now, in terms of energy and fuel supply, Russia publicly pledged uninterrupted fuel shipments to India. Now, this is something that we've talked about a lot in recent videos because Russia is being hit by drone attacks, so it's seeing tankers and pipelines and ports and refineries being attacked by Ukraine, and that's causing problems because when you have to shut down your refinery or shut down your port or your tanker gets taken out of action, and obviously you're going to struggle to be able to deliver all of that oil that's been ordered by all of your customers, including India. So Russia has said, don't worry, we'll have uninterrupted fuel shipments. Now, how they can actually make that statement, I don't know, because Russia doesn't really know what's going to happen in terms of the attacks on its ports and its tankers and its infrastructure. So it's one thing saying that, it's another thing actually delivering it. Now, interestingly, India did not commit publicly to future oil volumes. So there was no statement by Modi saying, yes, we will continue buying 2 million barrels per day. So Russia wants long-term energy ties, but India is non-committal. They haven't committed to doing anything. In terms of defense, they gave new commitments to co-produce and co-develop defense equipment in India. So that will be a made in India product. So this is a way of boosting employment in India. So I think this again is beneficial to India. Modi is happy to do things with Russia as long as it is in the interests of India. And there'll be more focus on spare part production, servicing, and technology transfer. So once again, Russia will be helping India to be able to make its own products. In terms of fertilizer and industrial cooperation, there are planned joint ventures, including a Russian urea fertilizer plant with Indian partners, which is designed to reduce India's dependence on imports and stabilize domestic supply. So once again, this is helping India develop its own fertilizer business rather than having to just import finished goods directly from places like Russia. And in terms of trade facilitation and connectivity, agreements to improve trade infrastructure links, explore using national currency. So that's interesting because the Indian rupee is obviously not accepted by Russia at the moment, and India doesn't accept Russian rubles. So they're going to have to work out a way of doing something. It may be that it's a digital payment system, so it's not actual physical currency that's being used. They're going to reduce non-tariff barriers and broaden the cooperation in agriculture, shipping, pharmaceuticals, nuclear space, and science. So a lot of interesting statements there, but not a lot of commitment from India. Now, if we have a look at this chart, it shows the amount of oil that India has been purchasing from Russia per month since the start of 2022. So, as we've just discussed, immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia had to find somebody else to buy all of the oil that Europe had stopped buying, and India was a willing partner because that oil was trading at a discount, so it represented a good deal from India's point of view. And you can see that by 2023, India was purchasing over 2.1 million barrels of oil every single day. That's a lot of oil and a lot of money. When we're talking about 2.1 million barrels of oil per day at a price of roughly $80 per barrel, that's over $168 million per day that India was paying to Russia. When you annualize that, that would be over $60 billion. So India was filling a huge gap that was left by all of the countries applying sanctions against Russia. And as you can see, India maintained a high level of purchasing in 2024 and the first part of 2025. However, things have started to turn down recently. You can see that in July, August, September, and October, the amount being purchased dropped to around 1.6 million barrels per day. Still quite a lot, but a significant reduction from the peak. We then saw a spike in November where it went up to over 1.8 million, and that was because it was announced that the two biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, were being hit with direct sanctions, but those sanctions weren't taking effect until the 21st of November. So Indian refiners took the opportunity to have a last-minute surge in the amount that they were buying, so they bulked up, they bought all of the extra oil, and then in December, we saw the orders falling to 1.2 million, and it's now come out that in January, it's down to 600,000, which is actually the lowest that we've seen since the start of 2022. So what we are seeing here is India pulling back from its relationship with Russia, not placing the amount of orders that it has done historically, because it's now facing sanctions as a result of dealing with these Russian entities. President Trump, as part of his tariff program, recently doubled the amount of tariff being applied against India. So they're paying a penalty of 30% because of the ongoing relationship with Russia. And that's going to get worse if Indian companies continue dealing with Rosneft, because it's now got direct sanctions. So if Indian companies are proven to be purchasing from Rosneft, then they themselves will be hit with sanctions. And that would mean that they wouldn't be able to trade with the USA or any other country that's applying sanctions. And if we have a look at this chart, it shows the breakdown of where India is exporting all of its goods to. India exports over $500 million worth of goods each year. And you can see that its biggest single market is the USA. 18% of all of those exports go to the USA. And if you look at the other countries here who are providing a lot of the markets, many of them are party to the sanctions. So India is potentially running the risk here of losing a lot of its export trade. And if you're wondering where Russia ranks on this chart, have to look all the way over to the right-hand side. Russia equates to around 1% of all of India's exports. So it isn't really very important. We saw that earlier in terms of the bilateral trade between the two countries. India's exports to Russia have increased a little bit in the last 5 years. Russia's exports to India have increased massively. So Russia needs to keep selling to India. India can't rely upon Russia to keep its economy going from its exports point of view because it gets lost in the roundings. So India needs to maintain all of these relationships with every other country. And the problem that Russia is facing is that India doesn't want to lose all of these sales because it's getting hit with sanctions as a result of continuing to buy Rosneft oil. So India is pulling back despite the fact that there was this meeting recently. There was no commitment from India to do anything. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I'm sure you've seen on the news wires, on the TV, that President Putin has gone over to India. And I think the initial impression from that is that India have welcomed Russia, that they want to strengthen the relationship. And you would assume that India would then start purchasing even more oil from Russia. However, I wanted to post this video really just to talk about the reality of the situation. India has been quite open over the past few years about its relationship with Russia. Prime Minister Modi has said that he will do the best for the country. So if it's in India's interest to buy Russian oil because it's the cheapest in the market, then they will do that. However, there comes a point when you can't keep on with that relationship. And I think we are now at that point because over the past few months, we have seen a huge increase in the sanctions being applied against Russia as a result of the fact that President Putin isn't really playing ball on the peace negotiations. Donald Trump was quite confident that he could bring an end to this war. Well, he originally said he was going to do it in one day, then it was going to be within the first few weeks. Now it wanted to be within 2025. None of that has obviously happened because Russia hasn't really given any sort of commitment that they're willing to sign a peace deal. In fact, the war seems to be raging more than ever as we talk more and more about peace. So as a result of the failure to come around the table and agree a deal, the USA has ramped up the sanctions on Russia. So we've seen direct sanctions being applied against the two biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, in addition to a strengthening of the price cap applied against Russian oil and lots of other measures that have been brought in recently. So it's now much more difficult to continue trading with Russian oil companies, and India doesn't want to lose its worldwide sales because Russia isn't very important. As we saw from the breakdown, it only equates to around 1% of India's exports. So 99% of India's sales are going to the rest of the world. So India needs to preserve those relationships rather than just worrying about Russia. Now, over the past few years, it has been beneficial to India to buy Russian oil because it was cheap. And it is still very cheap now. I talked recently about the fact that Russia is having to discount its oil as low as potentially $20 per barrel to persuade people to deal with them. But sometimes the cheapest deal isn't the best deal. And from India's point of view, if they continue buying that oil, they are running the risk of being hit with sanctions, and then they will lose all of their export business. And this could be a complete disaster because India, as I talked about recently, has seen a continued fall in the value of its currency, the Indian rupee. And we're also starting to see signs that there are problems emerging in the Indian economy, partly as a result of the tariffs that have been applied in the USA, its single biggest export market. So I wanted to post this video really just to highlight the fact that just because President Putin has flown to India doesn't mean that India has now signed a deal to buy tons of Russian oil. In fact, it looks like it's the complete opposite. India welcomed him because they still have an ongoing relationship, and I don't think they wanted to say you're not allowed to come. But I think this really shows that President Putin, because it's the first time he's been to India for 4 years, it shows that he's becoming a little bit more desperate. He needs to go out there and start spreading the word that Russia wants to do more business and to be seen going and shaking hands with leaders of different countries that are prepared to accept him. However, India, I think, have played quite a smart game here. They've come and said, okay, fine, you can come. We'll say hello. We'll have some meetings. We'll talk about increasing our cooperation with you, increasing the amount of trade between the two countries. But potentially that should mean that India starts exporting more to Russia, not that India will continue buying huge amounts of oil. In fact, I think it's unlikely that India will, because of these new sanctions and the risk that that would have to all of India's export markets. So the overall summary of today's video is that despite the recent meeting that was held in India between the leaders of India and Russia, India has not committed to buying more Russian oil. It hasn't committed to doing more trade in terms of buying more Russian things. What it wants is to use Russia's know-how to develop more infrastructure and employment in India, and also to sell more goods directly into Russia. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you have liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much to everyone that supported me. If you bought me a coffee or sent me YouTube super thanks or signed up as a Patreon or YouTube member or buy me a coffee member, thank you for that support. Really helps keep me going. And here's something to put a smile on your face.